Hi everyone, thanks for coming. My name is Maggie. I'm the Events and Marketing Manager here at Flyleaf. Thanks so much for coming and supporting our local authors. And by purchasing your book from us today, you enable programs like this to happen. So thank you so much for keeping it local and keeping us in the community. We really appreciate it. This evening we have the pleasure of hearing from Brian Biswas about his book, BLISTER and Other Stories, his new publication. Brian Biswas has published over 60 short stories in the U.S. as well as internationally. His short story, A Betrayal, was nominated for a Pushcart Prize and anthologized in The Aerial Reader. He is the author of the short story collection, A Betrayal and Other Stories, and the novel, The Astronomer. We hope you enjoyed the event. Thanks again, and if you haven't gotten a copy of BLISTER yet, we have copies for sale up at the register. I can turn it up a little bit if you want. You're on.
We didn't do a sound check.
I can bump it up now. Tell me how it sounds.
Let's see, how is that? Can people hear me okay? All right. Okay, that's good. Okay. How about that?
It's a bit tippy sometimes.
Yeah.
Is that better?
Yeah.
Oh, is that better?
Mm-hmm.
Okay. How about if I go over here? No, right now. Okay. Hello, everybody.
Hey.
Thanks for coming out. It really means a lot. And I really mean that. This is a super place to read. It is warm. It's inviting. There's no place I'd rather be to read. Just a super place. And you guys are all bright-eyed and bushy-tailed. I really appreciate that. Do people think that the audience gives the presenter energy?
Hope so. Yep.
Yeah, because you definitely do. Like, I can feel it. Yeah, I see light beams of energy coming out of your eyes, and Jan, you're pulsing with energy, feeding me. So tonight I'm going to launch right in to my first story, and I'll tell you the reason why on the other side. Has anybody had a chance to read any of these stories? Oh, good, excellent. So you're victims. There's a story about halfway in the book, and it's called Two Brief Love Stories. And it consists of two brief love stories. I'm going to read the first, which is just about 6 paragraphs long. And it is called A Love Story. It gets more inventive. A love story. This is a man goes into a bar story. Phil goes to a bar where he meets Sally. They hit it off, and after talking for several hours, they return to Phil's apartment where they have sex, which they both find satisfying. They repeat this procedure once a week for the next 2 months. At this point, Sally agrees to move in with Phil. The move goes smoothly. Several of Sally and Phil's friends even help out. Things seem to be going well. On their first anniversary, they go to a restaurant for dinner. They dress up. Sally has never looked more beautiful, nor Phil more handsome. Sally suspects that Phil is about propose. The food is delicious, the service superb. Their waiter delights them with a juggling act done with forks and knives. Sally laughs and rubs her foot against Phil's. Phil looks at Sally. Sally looks at Phil. This is it. Sally says to Phil, I love you. Phil says to Sally, yes. What does this mean? That yes, Phil loves Sally? Or that yes, Phil knows that Sally loves Phil? Or that Phil has simply recognized the predicate Sally has uttered? Or is it simply an equivocation on Phil's part? Is it all or part or none of these things? You can see that the possibilities are endless. And what is Sally to make of this? What's Sally to think? Regardless of what Sally thinks Phil has said, or rather meant, Sally's reply to Phil's equivocation is certain to be equally equivocal. And so on ad infinitum, until neither is saying a word the other understands. Though each thinks the other understands perfectly. At this point, Sally and Phil both sigh dreamily, each thinking that what they wished to hear was what, in fact, they heard. The troubles begin. Phil feels trapped. Phil considers embarking upon another relationship with Joan, but decides against it. Phil cares deeply about Sally. In fact, there's no one Phil cares more about right now than Sally, though Phil isn't prepared to make a lifelong commitment to Sally at this time. Even so, Phil isn't himself. Sally suspects an affair and confronts Phil. Phil denies any involvement. Phil says it's Sally, not he, who has changed. Sally threatens to move out. Phil tells Sally to go ahead. Sally starts to cry. Phil shouts, "This is all Sally's fault." Now both of them are crying. Phil says to Sally, "You no longer love me." Sally says to Phil, "Yes." What does this mean? That yes, Sally no longer loves Phil? Or that yes, Sally knows that Phil thinks that Sally no longer loves Phil? Or that Sally has simply recognized the predicate Phil has uttered? Or is it simply an equivocation on Sally's part? Is it all or part or none of these things? You can see that the possibilities are endless. And what's Phil to make of all this? What's Phil to think? At this point, Phil is so frustrated over the current state of their relationship that he shouts back in anger. "No, you never loved me." Sally reciprocates with equal ferocity. The conversation deteriorates from there until both throw up their hands in disgust and agree to go their separate ways. The end of the love story. So the second part of that, which I won't read, which you can read, is called Worms. And that's about a relationship that falls apart, a relationship of decades that falls apart because of a lack of communication. Worms being the things that have been eating away at the relationship over the years. So that's that piece. Does any of that sound familiar to anybody? So that's basically my life in 4 minutes. I'm an overanalyzer. It's amazing my wife has hung with me for so long because I just overanalyze everything. And if you want to read a story of super overanalysis, read the last story in the book called What Happened to Vincent Gutbaum One Day. That's What Happened to Vincent Gutbaum One Day. That's a story about a man who has a boring day job. And at night, he goes home and he writes magical stories filled with wonder and awe until one day he realizes he's become a character in one of his own stories. Also kind of like me. So anyway, that's story number one. So I forgot to say, welcome to Flyleaf. I'm always forgetting. As I always say, people who don't buy books from independent bookstores go to a bad place in the afterlife. So you don't want that to happen to you. So if you have the money, please buy a book or two on your way out and help support this great, thriving bookstore. Okay, so I'm going to read 3 stories tonight. I read the first. That means there are, 2 left? Okay. Once upon a time, I wanted to write a novel in which each chapter would be about the narrator's encounter with a different, strange woman. I could never come up with enough strange woman chapters, but I did have 4 before I decided it was time to move on to something else. So from those 4 chapters, I distilled 4 different episodes, and I combined them together, and I tacked on a little ending. And that became the story Rosé Claret, A Life. Now, by strange women, I mean strange women. There was the first section is about a woman named Gwenadine who, after she seduces her man, plunges a dagger into his breast and throws his body off a cliff into the ocean. And our narrator, Rosé Claret, at that time is a policeman, and he's sent out to apprehend her, and he ends up falling in love with her, of course, and has to extricate himself from that precarious situation. There was another strange woman episode where the woman, when she seduces her man, turns into a vulture and tortures him to death. And Rosé Claret, of course, falls under her spell and has to extricate himself from that situation. I'm going to read the second. You'll be happy to know that no murders are committed in this one, but the woman is strange. You could call this happiness. That sounds happy. Happiness. I was seated on a park bench. This is Rosé Claret, the narrator. I was seated on a park bench, watching the clouds as they floated serenely by, when, seemingly out of nowhere, a young woman appeared and fell onto the bench beside me. She was a pretty woman, mid-20s, I guessed, but her face was flushed and her skirt rumpled as if she'd been in a fight. Fearing the worst, I tried to ask if something was wrong, but I couldn't get 2 words in edgewise. She was in a state of feverish excitement, and her words would not stop. This is what she said. I am happy. Oh, I'm so happy. I have a new lover, you see, a kind and gentle man, and what I have hoped, dreamed, and wished for what has seemed centuries, has finally come to pass, to be realized as a living, breathing truth. And the life of the most abject misery My life until now has finally come to an end. In how many ways have I imagined I would meet my love? While strolling down the Rue de Le Monde in Paris, it's love at first sight. Our eyes meet. I see into the depths of his soul. He sees into the depths of mine. On the hot sands of the Sahara, the sun burning our bodies, our flesh throbbing with youthful love, our lips meet. His tongue tastes mine. I take his hand, and he is mine. On the beach at Devil's Cove, warm, salty spray fills the air. Our minds have become one, our hearts one. I've never felt more at peace. Our love is slow, delicious, and bountiful. But in the end, it was much simpler. I met my love while walking home from work, an ordinary event on an ordinary day. We couldn't wait to reach the bed in my apartment. It was nearly a mile away, but instead hurried to an empty field that was nearby and fell upon the grass. He pulling off my clothes, I pulling off his, until we lay naked on the grass, mad with a love we knew to be eternal. And all the love that had been inside of me, waiting impatiently to be released, was released. And I knew at last the true meaning of fulfillment. We've met many times since. Each encounter, dare I say it, even better than the one before. And now I can say, with the utmost conviction, that everything in my life is wonderful, absolute perfection. Imagine you're sitting on a park bench and somebody says all that to you. She continues, of course my lover isn't real. Such a magnificent creature has never walked the earth, nor ever will. Nor would I wish it otherwise, for if he were corporeal, if he breathed the air we do, by that very act, he would become imperfect. And therefore, our love would become imperfect. And that I simply could not stand. My lover may not be real, but in my thoughts he's real, and it's precisely this reality of his unreality that gives him substance, like a ghost that haunts the night, except he haunts my days and nights. This is what I like best about my lover. He comes when I call him. He comes when I wish it. He's not a particularly young man. In fact, he's a man well along in years, but he's a magnificent lover nonetheless. His hair is jet black, black as night, black as hell, and curls around the collar. His cheekbones are high, his nose long and prominent, like a hawk's. His neck is graceful, his torso muscular and smooth. But it's his eyes, his dark brown eyes, that hold me transfixed. I can't take my eyes from them. They're as large as chestnuts and seem to sparkle with a light that emanates from deep within. Peering into his eyes is like peering into another world, a world where there's no time, no place, no existence as you or I know it. He always wears a black cloak with brass buttons down the middle. It makes him look demonic. And when he opens it up, I see the universe inside, the sun, the moon, and all the stars. My lover is always ready to entertain me, to do whatever I desire, but he's also always the gentleman. He takes me dancing, to the theater, and on romantic trips abroad. There's no place we can't go. He's so kind, so gentle. And when we make love, that is kind and gentle too, as is the sleep which follows, kind and gentle, filled with sweet dreams and peace. He bows when it's time to leave. He looks so somber as he kisses my hand. Until we meet again, he says, and then a smile brightens his face. I can't suppress a giggle. I'm 16 years old again, innocent and unassuming. I've never been so happy. She left me then, after her long talk, she left me then, dancing aimlessly across the park, like a butterfly lost in flight. I smiled and thought to myself, such is the nature of happiness. It doesn't reflect what really is, it reflects what we believe. And any belief may become a reality, provided only one has the will to believe it is so. And that's the end of section 2, happiness. After that one is the vulture section, which you can read on your own. I don't want to read any stories about death tonight. Okay, let me take a little break. Is there a question or two? Does anybody have a question? You can ask me anything. What makes you think you can write? Are you really this weird? Yes, please.
You seem like a very analytical romantic.
Well, that what?
Here, that's much different than the astronomer.
Which you've read.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, yeah, as I said, that was my life in 4 minutes. The overanalyzer. Yeah. So that is true. Anything else?
So how long have you been working on this one?
Okay. This book. I think there are 21 stories here, and about 2/3 of them had been published over the last 20 years or so. The others I wrote during the pandemic because I didn't have anything else to do. I should mention the cover.
Yeah, the cover's beautiful.
The cover is gorgeous. The cover was designed by a lady in Melbourne, Australia. She also did the cover to A Betrayal and Other Stories. It's the same artist. She was a wonder to work with. So this is actually an image from the title story, Blister. Here's a young woman looking over a cliff. And I don't know if you can see, but here's the full moon, and in front of the full moon is a ship. And her husband is on that ship. And he's sailing to Australia. And she looks sad, right? She looks sad. And bad things are going to happen. But I won't tell you what. Okay, I have one more story to read. So I was born and I was raised in Columbus, Ohio. Has anybody here been to or from Columbus? From Ohio? They say Columbus is a great place to have left.
Sorry.
Yeah, when I grew up there in the 60s, and it was basically an overgrown cow town pretending to be a city. So it wasn't all that exciting, but it wasn't that bad. We lived, Ohio State University is in Columbus. We lived maybe 6 miles from Ohio State University on the edge of these woods right in the middle of town called Valhalla. I always thought Valhalla was German for forest. But it turns out it's a Nordic word, and it stands for the entrance to the Hall of the Doomed, which kind of befitted the place because it was spooky. It was not Columbus as a whole, I mean that area. But it was kind of spooky. It had a slope that went way down. We lived right on the edge of it. The slope that went way down. And at the bottom was this ravine. And then the slope went way up. And then there was more woods. And as kids, we'd have a blast running down the slope and jumping over the ravine and then going up the other side. And on top of the other side, about 50 feet in, there was this house. It was a one-story brick house. It was a house, it wasn't a shack. But it looked abandoned, and there was no driveway leading up to it, but there was a path. So there was a rumor. The rumor was that the house was haunted, right? So me and my friends would go out there at dusk, and we didn't want to get too close in case it really was haunted. And we'd look for lights or signs of ghosts, and we never saw anything. But and eventually just forgot about it. But that image always stuck in my mind. So of course, one day I decided I wanted to write a story about that, and so I did. This is a ghost story or a ghostly story, and I called it. So what do you think I called it? What? Valhalla. That would have been good. That would have been better than what I did. I called it The House in the Forest. You know, not all my titles are boring. No, I have some good titles. Swimming in the Ocean is Wrong. The Town That Went to Sleep. Those are more interesting. But I did what I did. So The House in the Forest. They said the house in the forest was haunted. They said an old woman and her husband lived there many years before, that they bickered endlessly, that she murdered him one gusty autumn night, poisoned him with blueberry muffins laced with cyanide, but was not found guilty beyond a reasonable doubt, and now lived alone in a one-story house in the backwoods of South Carolina, where the days were cloaked in shadows and the nights were filled with shifting sounds. A prisoner in the softened forest, they said. My sister Jill and I loved to roam through the forest after school. Valhalla was a primeval forest filled with maple and oak and pine. The scent of honeysuckle, spice bush, and partridge berry floated on the air. We pretended we were detectives as we tracked unsavory characters along the trails and the underbrush. There was Mr. Big, the notorious criminal from Texas, a man always on the run. Aunt Mary, Cousin Jeff, and Uncle John, the outlaw gang from Mississippi. Their latest heist, a bank robbery in the north of the state. Perhaps they'd come to South Carolina to stash the loot. And then there was T-Bone Frank, 6'10", with meaty hands, lumberjack arms, and nerves of steel. He had blood in his eyes and was rumored to have killed a man in Charleston. Who knew what he was up to now? We never caught anyone, of course, for they existed only in our imagination. But even so, we had endless days of fun. There was a river that ran through the forest, the water of which was the color of burnt copper. Jill and I would go there and stand upon the clay that formed the river's bank, observe the weeds swaying beneath the gentle current, the white polished stones that looked like dinosaur eggs, the silver fish that hid amongst them, search for pirate treasure that was rumored to be buried nearby, treasure that we never found. But it was in the lurking shadows of a dreary rock that lay near the river that we found a note addressed to us, the children of the forest. Be careful, was all it said. You see, I've embellished things a bit. We were always careful to avoid the house in the forest, for it was rumored that the old woman kidnapped children, and we both knew what she did with them. We played many games together in the dappled light under the pine trees, hide and go seek, hopscotch, sticks and stones. We talked of many things, of what we would become, when we grew up, of the adventures we would undertake, of what the world would look like. Soon my thoughts were lost in the swirl of dreams, but always the old woman loomed in the back of my mind. One day, my sister dared me to go into the forest at night. It was late in the month of October. The sky was dotted with clouds. The air was cool and crisp. Leaves had fallen all around, forming a soft carpet on the forest floor. Might we catch a glimpse of the old woman knitting by the fireplace? When night fell, we entered the forest about 100 yards from the house, crawled on our hands and knees, the twigs cracking like pistol shots. I was scared stiff, but I managed to conceal my fear. It was my sister who reached the house first, and when she did so, the moon emerged from beyond a cloud. It was a gibbous moon, the color of lead. The house in the forest was made of stone. The windows were small, many paned, and high up from the ground. One end of the house had a large stained glass window that emitted a tenuous glow in the pale light of the moon. Smoke billowed from the chimney. A gravel walkway overgrown with weeds led up to a dimly lit front door. There was a light on inside the house, and I could imagine the old lady seated in her rocking chair, a loaded shotgun across her lap. I watched as Jill made her way through the wild hawthorn bushes that surrounded the house, climbed atop an iron railing, and peered through a half-opened window. Jill could see into the living room, and she called back to me that it was empty. She observed that the walls were painted a dull yellow and cobwebs were visible above a doorway. A large painting hung on one wall. It looked like a painting of an elderly couple. She said, a count and countess perhaps. The woman was portrayed in vibrant red colors that seemed to snake into her soul, while the man blazed black as midnight, lending to each one the aspects of fire and of death. My sister glanced back at me and laughed. Sissy, she said, your eyes look as though they're about to pop out of their sockets. Well, I said, where is she? I felt a knot in my stomach. My sister paused. Want to go inside? I felt the earth quivering like jelly beneath my feet. Go ahead. Jill was through the window in a flash, and I reluctantly followed. It was in the bedroom that we found the old woman. She was a little woman with honey-colored eyes and a sad face. She looked almost hollow. Her neck was pale, bird-like. Her arms were thin as matchsticks. She was sitting up in a queen-sized bed, reading from a black book. She uttered a cry when she saw us. She probably thought we were burglars, for her eyes opened wide and her face turned stark white. She shut the book and placed it beside her, put her hands palm up on the bed sheets. We just wanted to see if you really exist, I stammered. If you don't leave at once, I'll call the police, she said. Her voice was steady. After all, she was a murderess, and her lower lip quivered as if in silent rage. I don't know what overcame me then, but suddenly I felt emboldened. People say your house is haunted, I said. She frowned. And you believe them? That you kidnap children? Is that so? That you killed your husband? Don't believe everything you hear. But you did kill him, didn't you? Silence. It occurred to me then that if she had killed her husband, she could just as easily kill me now and not think twice about it. I looked at my sister. Her face was white with fear. He died of old age, the old woman continued, peacefully in his sleep. It happens that way if we are lucky. She spoke the words calmly, without a hint of apprehension, but I noticed that her hands were trembling, and I saw upon her hands a network of tiny lines, lines that crisscrossed her palms, lines that formed the very image of a dead man's face. My sister said, "Let's go." It must have been shortly thereafter when the old woman left the house in the forest. There was a rumor that she'd been run out of town. Jill and I stayed away from the forest for a while. We talked of anything but the old woman. We played in the fields at the edge of town, ran barefoot through grass that was like a cloak of moss stretched out upon the earth. But in the springtime, we returned to the forest. The trees were green, wildflowers bloomed in a myriad of colors. Another rumor, this time that the old woman, or rather her ghostly silhouette, had returned to haunt the house in the forest. There was talk that the men of the town were going to burn her place to the ground so that we would finally be rid of her forever. But nothing came of it, and the incident was eventually forgotten, except by me and my sister. We would never forget, for we had seen her. We returned many nights thereafter to check for the light in the house, but it was never on, and I was not about to go up to the front door and knock. The end. So that is a reminiscence of childhood. Elaborated a bit. Okay, questions. There must be some questions. There are always questions. Linda.
Where do you get your rich and varied ideas?
They just, well, I was going to say they just pop into my head, but that's kind of flip. I mean, some of them do pop into my head. A lot of them are just images that I guess pop into my head. It might be something I'm reading or see, observe, experience. I usually have an image that pops in my head and I just can't get it out unless I write a story about it. So for me, writing stories is really survival because if I don't do that, I can't sleep.
Right.
Ariel, yeah.
Your scenes are so visually impressive. What did the journey look like getting better at that?
Yeah.
Writing.
Good to see you. Thanks for
Yeah.
It's practice. It's just, I mean, I started writing when I was 16.
Wow.
Okay, I'm in my 60s now. And you write a couple stories. It's really hard when you're first starting out because you want to just write it straight and get it done.
Yeah.
And also you fall in love with everything you have written. So it becomes very hard to get rid of stuff that really doesn't belong. So you need to develop that skill of, I'm lucky I have a terrific editor who's in the back there, wife editor, who has no problem with her red pen whatsoever. In fact, we would get into endless fights over each and every sentence. What do you mean that's not good? It's perfect. And a lot of times the sentences or paragraphs you have are really good, but they don't belong. But they just don't belong. So you just have to develop that, keep a file where you have all your great sentences that don't belong and put them there, and maybe you can recycle them. So,
That's good.
I don't know, does that answer the
That's
question?
great, yeah.
Okay, but it's basically practice. And another good thing is to always have several pieces that you're working on at once. So you have the one story or novel, work on it for a while, get through a draft, and put it aside and go on to number 2
Oh, that's good.
and number 3, and then come back to the first one, at which, if you're like me, you'll have forgotten it, basically. So you're reading it for the first time, and you go, yuck. You've got to be kidding. Yes?
Yeah, comment that the different stories that you read, I mean, I see something in your stories,
Tell me.
the few, that is that you question reality in all of them. It's a little like Kafka or Proust. You get deep into that, you are continuously questioning reality, and you end up seeing that reality is not that real. And like most people that do that end up writing something that sounds like
Most people that do that end up
magical realism. And I see your stories always questioning the mechanism of reality, what we say, what we do. And that's kind of a theme for me, which I find fascinating,
Yeah.
because sometimes we don't do that. And reality is sort of porous, it's not as solid as we think it is.
I was a philosophy major,
I guess.
if you can guess. So I was a crazy kid, really. I was always thinking all the weird stuff. Where did I come from? What's real? What's not real? What's imagined? Yeah. So I guess my mind just naturally thinks that way. A lot of what I write is magical realism, which is basically taking a realistic story and then distorting it slightly so it becomes kind of magical. I'm really interested in time, as I know you are, and the meaning of time and how time twists and turns. And sometimes it seems to go by like that, and other times it seems to go by like this.
I was going to give you magical realism. This seems to be a bit of a break from that genre a little bit. I mean, I haven't read the book yet, so I'm not sure.
Oh, well, actually, I guess the 3 stories I read weren't that magical. But most of the stories are magical.
So yeah, you said the strange women, or they actually have a magical quality to them, and I guess that's what.
Right. Brenda.
So, Brian, when you start a story, do you know where it's going to go? Do you have the end in mind, or do you start with the image and then kind of figure it out? How do you?
Sometimes, yeah. Well, yes. Yes. I mean,
What does that mean?
It means sometimes I'll have the last sentence so I know where it's going to end,
Interesting.
and then I work towards that. Other times I'll have just this image, like with A Betrayal, I had my first book of short stories, I had this image of a woman walking into a forest, and there are these gloomy trees over her. That's all I had. So I asked myself, what's she doing? Where's she going? What's going to happen to her? And I build a story around that. A lot of times that changes, as you develop it, because it's not going anywhere. I don't know if that makes sense.
Yeah, it does. It's great. Thank you.
But having the ending helped me initially when I was starting out. If you have that ending, because then you know what you're working towards. If you don't really know where you're working, if you're just starting out writing and you don't know what you're working towards, you're gonna at least go all over the place and get frustrated. Any other questions? Questions? You don't want to go home and say, "Oh, I wish I'd asked that question."
And do you have a feedback page or something like that when people read, they can actually send you messages and say, I read your book and tell me about this?
Well, my email's on my website, so you can contact me that way.
I know you have an Instagram page as well, so.
Yeah, I'm supposed to.
Okay.
I hate social media, but if you do this, you have to have Facebook and Instagram. I refuse Twitter. Don't go there. Okay. Well, thank you everybody for coming out. This was a lot of fun.
Thank you.
If you want to buy it, we have a few more copies left of BLISTER. If you want to buy any other copies, we've got them at the register. So